Okay, so this is essentially a very high level control structure model just to represent the relationships between the broad components in the control structure. So what I've highlighted here is that there is essentially a component in the structure broadly called the government. And obviously if you abstract that, there's a lot of stuff going on inside there, but obviously for this starting point it's appropriate to keep it high level. Then we've got some form of response and recovery controller, and that is essentially performing a particular mission. So I'm purposefully keeping it high level because I don't want to blow people's minds on the first contact. Then we've got the general public, and I've split that up into business owners and employers. I don't know if you can read that okay. And obviously they have their own mission, for want of a broad term, and one of those is their health and safety, their well-being, but also their purpose in life and economic activity, should we say. Now, between the government and the public, there are direct communication channels, which I don't know if anyone else had this, but a few months ago we had the text message alert that basically said you're home arrest now, stay at home. But then there's also communications through the media and through social media as well. That's quite a sort of modern thing. Now, the lockdown changes, or the changes over the weekend that were announced, there's been a lot of conversation about them being, a bit generic, not very clear, not very specific. And so the reason I drew this control structure model was just to highlight that between the government issuing their control actions, for want of a better description, to the public, there is a level of different levels of hierarchy and different stakeholders, different components between the government and the general public. Now, when we're talking about the what you might call commander's intent or mission command approach to controlling a response to an emergency, the control algorithm of that component, the government, they may behave in an approach where they issue control actions based on what the goal or intent is. So they're not necessarily going to be prescriptive commands or very specific. It's essentially up to the receivers of that control action to do an assessment themselves and control, the way that they behave appropriately. Now, of course, generally people might call that common sense, and I think, the great majority of the public, do have common sense and can deal with that. But there are certainly certain vulnerable users or people in certain situations that do need some form of prescriptive or specific commands. And so there's already an observation there that the government, when they're issuing these instructions, there should be two flavors. One is a goal, mission, command, intent, so that people can essentially do an assessment and decide for themselves. But there should also be specific commands and instructions for particular people, particular industries, especially people doing special things or are sensitive to certain issues such as healthcare workers or transport workers. But also it's important to recognise the place that the play that the media has, and also social media, because clearly the general, the normal typical media, they have a good direct connection with the government where they can receive information and ask questions, but the behaviour of that component, we generally expect it to behave appropriately, so that information passed to the public is, of a safety-related nature, is nice and clear, and there's no politics associated with it. But the general media seem to be playing politics quite a lot, which is causing extra unnecessary anxiety in the general population and mixing up confusion and controversy because they can profit from it. So there are questions over the media's behaviour and how the government should interact with the media. Then we've got the social media aspects, where obviously the general public can talk and interact and talk about things and ideas and have conversations and arguments. But there's also the general view that certain members on social media have taken action to start up their own I think the term is independent SAGE. So there are a number of influencers that have got together to create their own controller that is doing SAGE type activity. But the tension between that unofficial entity and what the government is doing and how the government behaves is essentially, as well as with the media, it is generating extra traffic in terms of communications and discussions and distractions and using energy and time, which should really be best used in managing the response and recovery and making sure that the public is appropriately supported and reassured. And so there are some, I think the word hostile is perhaps a bit too strong, but we have to recognise that some of these components in the control structure are not necessarily playing to the best intentions of the whole system together, and actually are wasting resources and causing more problems than are strictly necessary. I've necessarily used high-level abstract labels for these components in the control structure so that I can be very broad about things, but then also start to talk in detail. So this response and recovery controller, the label I've used is to highlight that it does cover a lot of organizations, a lot of people, and a lot of technology just within that one block. And so if I was to abstract this model and effectively zoom into that block, you'd see things like the Department of Health coordination with the NHS, with the emergency services, including the police, fire and rescue and ambulance services. You would also include the local government departments that are involved with liaising and coordinating supply chains and transportation and things like that. So I've necessarily used the high-level label to represent those functions, but that's essentially to keep the model relatively high level and not too detailed to put people off straight away. So the word mission is to represent whatever missions each of those items will have to do. So in the case of the response, the mission associated with the response is to deal with the medical aspects associated with the coronavirus itself, the discussion about testing or developing a test, and then in terms of recovery, that could involve what would you call it, the burying of bodies perhaps. Yeah, but also been mindful that obviously some members of that public and some of those business owners and employers, they also form part, some of them potentially form part of the response and recovery, such as healthcare workers or even people removing debris, removing waste, for example. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is the thing with the so-called independent SAGE that's been established. So whilst that's really good for giving the general public some different ideas to think about and things to talk about, if that independent entity interacts with the media and with the government through social media, that extra workload on the government entity, the extra time and energy and everything else that's involved with doing that, actually makes the government response and coordination of the actual emergency that much more difficult and potentially distracting. So that's just a very high level control structure model. And the main intent of this was just to highlight that these interactions across different levels of the hierarchy, if you've got a direct control action from the government to the public, it may be appropriate to have goal-based or intent-based control actions, but that's not necessarily one size fits all for everybody. There should be some prescriptive commands, especially for people that might be involved in critical activities. In terms of returning or recovering the situation, so there are sort of two broad areas really of recovery. We've got the business and economic recovery that we need to think about, which I've not sort of made explicit on here because I'm referring to response and recovery very broad. That includes both healthcare but also economy. but also the restart and run up, and then the monitoring and response to that. So if we have different parts of the economy that start up in a way that's not coordinated, they can potentially starve each other of resources, perhaps. Well, a good example would be the London mayor affecting the way that the transport in London is resourced. So there's lots of people who need to go back to work for economic and other reasons, but there isn't enough public transport to enforce the high-level safety constraints of social distancing. Now, I'll show on this next picture why that is, so just bear with me. So this is a different perspective. I've tried to make this sort of a bit clearer. But again, this is a work in progress. It is a model that I'm developing. It will change and evolve, but I'm just trying to represent some of the high-level controllers in this structure. So at the bottom here, we've got the actual local response that's dealing with the emergency. So in terms of this picture on the left-hand side, I'm referring about this part of the control structure here, if you can see my mouse moving around. So this strategic coordinating group, agencies, gold commander, silver, bronze commander, and the local response, all of that is sort of inside this response and recovery down to the mission at the bottom. Then as we move further up the control structure, we've got what are called these entities called government officers. Now, it's not clear in the information that I've reviewed exactly what they are, what their function is, but further research should uncover that. Now, they have in that layer of the hierarchy this person or group called the Government Liaison Officer, the GLO. Now, they perform a really important part of this structure between the response and recovery up into the government. So they're actually part of the part of the coordination and communication function, as you can see I've highlighted with this red line. And then further up in the top, this government box I was talking about earlier on, this is all contained inside that government box. So if I just spread that across a little bit. So you'll notice that we've got the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and then the central government. They are essentially in control of what's called the Cobra, the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, and that is essentially the prime decision maker in an emergency response and recovery situation. On this particular control structure, given the level of detail, I'm just sort of highlighting the broad entities involved in this. So we've got the concept of the Cobra, we've got the concept of the Cobra Secretariat. They establish what's called a battle rhythm. Now, strictly speaking, I shouldn't include this on the control structure model because, technically speaking, that is a type of algorithm which defines the behavior of the Cobra and its interactions and information flows across the different levels of hierarchy and interactions with other controllers in that hierarchy. Then we've got a key stakeholder, a key component is the lead government department. Now, in this case, it is the Department of Health, but I'll come back to that. And then that lead government department is split into two. So there's the lead government department for the response, and then the same for the recovery. Now, they could be the same government department depending on the type of emergency, or they could actually be different. So there are decisions made at this sort of high level in between the Prime Minister's office, the Home Secretary, and certain other ministers about who the lead government department is, either overall or in charge of response or recovery, or whether that's spread across different departments. So what you've highlighted there is certainly a case for coordination and timing issues. Now, on the side of all of this, we've got the concept of a devolved administration, which could be either Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, or in the real world, all three of them, given the widespread nature of this emergency. And that introduces complexities, delays, and political difficulties in its own right, but I'll come back to that. And then tacked onto the side of the Cobra is what's called the News Coordination Centre. I say tacked on the side, it's technically part of Cobra. But that News Coordination Centre is essentially the prime interface between the government and the general public and the media. So this part here that I'm talking about is essentially this part here. Now you'll notice that I've stuck the Mayor of London on there, which is interesting. Now the Mayor of London has a responsibility to communicate with Londoners about the safety related information. So whether they should stay at home or not, or whether they should use public transport or not. Now it's quite interesting that that's sort of been made explicit, but the Mayor of London is a key part of the control, a broad word, of the general public in London, but the Mayor of London is not necessarily involved as an executive decision maker in this part of the control structure, which I think is presenting some difficulties. Now on top of that, you've also got the political aspects of having a Labour Mayor of London versus a Conservative government, but that's something else. Now when we move towards the higher levels of the control structure, so not immediately involved in the emergency response, but certainly a core part of it, we've got the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is required to interface with NATO, the EU and the United Nations, and then forms the interface with other countries. So if we need help or we want to help other countries and we receive requests for help, then it's coordinated through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which you'll notice is not necessarily directly involved in Cobra at continuously while the emergency is going on. Then you've got the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's Office, and I've not been able to clarify exactly how that all fits together at this high level of the control structure just yet. But it's interesting to note that there is a interaction between the Cabinet Office and the EU and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the EU, but they're for different purposes. So there are questions there over how that response is coordinated. One of the things with trying to build a control structure model is it is a combination of a functional control structure and the components within that model. So these boxes on here, sometimes they represent a real physical person or organization, or they represent a concept, and that concept could be a mixture of physical or functional or even natural language that people use. So when we talk about the physical location of the Cobra meetings versus the label Cobra, there is some interpretation in there that's not necessarily clear, because I'm sort of coming at this cold, and the information I've used is not necessarily that clear cut as an engineering specification, but it's absolutely a valid observation. There is also the aspects of the World Health Organization and how they interact, how these elements up here interface and interact with the decision making of the Cobra. Now I've not got that reflected on this model because I've not been able to get that detail just yet. So what I'm going to show you now is some of the overview of the work I've been doing the last sort of 2 weeks. Now I've not been doing it solid for 2 weeks because I've not been too well, but this will just sort of give you an idea. So this is a picture. I know it's very small, so bear with me a second. This is a picture, a PDF file from some software I use on my iPad called Liquid Text, and it allows you to review documents, PDF documents, extract information onto a workspace, and then draw relationships between that information. So it really helps with gaining understanding of lots of information very quickly, but also you can start to spot patterns and related information and inconsistencies. Now there are sort of 4 broad columns there that you can see. Now they represent information extracted from, in this one on the left, this is the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 that I went through last week. This document here, number 2, is the concept of operations, which describes the concept of operations for the Cobra and how it interacts with all the other elements in the control structure that I've already highlighted. This 3rd document is, let's just have a look, I can't remember what that one is. That one is the emergency preparedness documentation. And then this fourth one is the enhanced SAGE guidance from October 2012. So I've reviewed those 4 pieces of information, extracted information, made notes, and then as I've been going along, I've been trying to develop the control structure. And it sort of starts in small pieces, high level, like the first picture I showed you, and then this is sort of the starting point. So if I go back to the picture, so if you imagine this is the government at the top, the response and recovery, and then the conduct of that mission, this broadly relates to this part here. So if you imagine, let me just zoom in, so very high level abstraction, we've got emergency management in control of an emergency, so that's as high level as you can get. Then we've got then I've taken that and abstracted it further. So emergency management has 3 parts. There is the preparation and pre-planning, the response, and then the recovery. And then as part of response, there's 2 other elements. One is about the crisis management, and then one is about the consequence or impact management. So if we go back to this high level control structure, if I was to develop this box and this one down here, it would contain those 3 elements with those 2 aspects there. So these 2 here, crisis management and consequence management, they split into a number of parts. So there is prevent or avert an imminent emergency, mitigate its effect, prevent further damage or disruption, secure the scene. So as I'm sure you can see, when you start looking at those aspects, you can start to imagine what the actual physical people and organisations would be that are involved in those aspects. So you can imagine that secure the scene will definitely involve some of the police service, for example. Mitigating its effects would definitely involve some of the healthcare aspects, and in terms of preventing or averting an imminent emergency, I'm sure you can imagine there will be some crisis planners in that, but also potentially people in control of entry and exit to ports. Now we'll come, if you can imagine, keep that port control at the back of your mind for later on. Consequence management, prevent the impact of the incident escalating, so that would be a combination of the emergency services, but also the people involved in assessing, trying to understand the virus and sharing information across international boundaries. Impact management, that would include people involved in the procurement and supply of PPE, for example, and then the recovery phase. I'm sure you can think of some examples yourself there. Now, obviously, these are high-level concepts, and the actual control structure that implements those things will be variable, different things, but there'll also be common parts, common responsibilities shared across there. Now, let me zoom out and look at some of the other stuff. So, let's just zoom out to the top. There we go. So this here is taken from, or the detail that I've used to build this has come from the SAGE guidance and the Civil Contingencies Act. Now you'll notice this is a lot more complicated than the first 2 that I've showed you. Now this is, in terms of developing a control structure model, one of the ways I go about it is I basically capture as much as I can based on what's relevant, and then I'll start to iterate it and make it simpler and more abstract, so it's not, a complete brain explosion, if you like. Now if you just ignore the black lines for a moment, or try to, I know it's a bit difficult, you'll notice that this is the Cobra in the middle, Cabinet Office briefing rooms, the situation cell, which coordinates situation reports and controls the commonly recognised information picture. We've got the Government Office for Science, which interacts with the government, with the Cabinet Office, the Prime Minister's Office, and then the ministerial groups and UK government. You've got the devolved administrations that I discussed earlier on, so the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, North. So the ministerial group is not necessarily the Cabinet, it is a selection of certain ministers involved in that cooperation and coordination. So one of those will be the Home Secretary, another one of those might be the Defence Secretary, for example. But as I say, this bit of the control structure needs further the development based on the available information, but it is starting to take shape. So that's the SAGE bit. This part here, this is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. They coordinate with the Cobra through a SAGE secretariat, and they coordinate with the lead government departments as required. That is chaired by the SAGE chair or co-chair with SAGE representatives, and sometimes that coordinates with what's called the government's chief scientific advisor, which I'm sure you'll have seen on the news. There is a DV security classified part of SAGE, given the interaction with the intelligence cell within the Cobra, if that's necessary. You've also then got the Scientific Advisory Group, which supports SAGE, and then any subgroups or subgroups of security cleared individuals. Now they produce what's called a UK-wide situation and technical situation, scientific and technical situation report, a SITREP. They also create option papers and response scenario papers, and they also coordinate with lower levels of science and technical advice cells, which directly coordinate with the emergency response organisations. So that's how the SAGE sort of fits in there and coordinates with Cobra, and then Cobra essentially makes the decisions based on that information. So I hope that's sort of clear. The only other sort of final part in shot really is just to highlight that having the devolved administrations, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland, they are responsible for different parts of the planning and response to an emergency. And so when Nicola Sturgeon goes on the news and talks about what her perspective is, she is entitled to do that because she is in the Scottish executive. But obviously the newspapers and the media like to play political point scoring with that, which is not necessarily helpful to the response. So that's it. That's where we've got to. I'll continue doing some work to develop that further, and then as I start to find more sort of interesting aspects, I can share those at the next meeting. Okay, so generally I've sort of been a bit so this is the concept of operations. So this essentially defines the lead government department and the Cobra and its behaviour. And then there is the SAGE enhanced SAGE guidance here that sort of defines how the SAGE works. Now these documents are separated in time. So the CONOPS was first developed in 2010. There were some changes in regulations which were not updated in the CONOPS. And then in 2012 the enhanced SAGE guidance was released. But these documents, guidance documents, etc., they're not controlled like system specifications or maps or models or drawings or anything like that. And I don't know who has created those documents, apart from on the front cover it basically says that it's the Home Office or the Cabinet Office. It doesn't sort of say specifically. There is also the aspect that the Civil Contingencies Act, I understand, has not actually been implemented. Part 2 of the Civil Contingencies Act was used to essentially create emergency regulations, which I believe is the Coronavirus Act that I've yet to look at, because it's 7 times bigger than the Civil Contingencies Act, and apparently was put together in the space of 2 or 3 days. So yeah. That is a great question. So one of the things that's interesting about the SAGE is that his attendance, I understand, at the SAGE doesn't necessarily need to be documented, and strictly speaking, in accordance to the SAGE guidance, he wouldn't necessarily have any kind of input or interaction or influence over the output of the SAGE. But obviously he will be able to sit on this side of the control structure and see and hear what's going on, and then when he moves over to this part of the control structure and talks directly with the Prime Minister or senior ministers, clearly his perspective of what's going on down here could influence the decision making that's going on up here. And if he's not necessarily a scientist or engineer trained, he might misinterpret the information and conversations that are going on here. So whilst I think it's appropriate he is sat in there to hear and see how things are going, I think it's wholly appropriate if he's shown to be using that interpretation to influence this part of the control structure. So he would be sat sort of between here and here. No, it's important though. It's an important aspect though, because his presence and the way it affects the operation of this science and decision making could be important. But I would argue that the media are probably blowing it up out of proportion for the sake of it. Just a point about that. When we were talking about the media interest and the media behaviour, that could have a chilling effect on the members of the SAGE and whether they're willing or able to give advice and support, which I think is an important aspect that should be considered. There was something also interesting, is healthcare in terms of care homes and control of care homes is not discussed at all. So that suggests that it's not controlled appropriately, and given the level of deaths that we've been reported, I'm not kind of surprised